Alright, we've been avoiding talking about this game for too long. I think it's time we just discussed it and got it over with. We've come close to talking about Metroid Other M several times since we started the show. We were actually planning to do it during our first batch of episodes, but by the time we got around to it, pretty much everything had already been said. Besides, we aren't a review show, and we don't really do rants, and we don't plan to change that now. Rather, this episode's going to be about what we can learn from Other M going forward. There are a lot of other beloved silent protagonists out there, so if the industry ever decides to fill those empty vessels the way they did Samus, how can they do it better? Before we get to the game itself, we have to begin by looking at the developer chosen to breathe personality into Samus. Team Ninja is best known for bringing Ninja Gaiden to the 21st century, and for giving us Dead or Alive Beach Volleyball, the game that popularized the term breast physics, made all the more memorable by that famous decision to run their physics simulation on each breast independently. That made for some creepy imagery. All told, probably not the best team to take on the job of delivering a character like Samus. They've never made a serious attempt at storytelling in their games before, and the inexperience shows in Other M. Now, obviously, that observation's already been made 1,000 times across the internet. But if it's so clear to the rest of us, I guess the big question is, why did it happen in the first place? Who at Nintendo decided, you know who we really need to bring in to tell Samus' story to the world? The jiggle physics guys. They get women. Who actually thought that? To tell you the truth, I'm not sure anyone actually did. I'm not so sure it was a conscious choice. So Yoshio Sakamoto approached Team Ninja because he loved Ninja Gaiden, understandably, and planned to write the story himself. A decent plan, in theory. Sakamoto handles the story and lets Team Ninja do what they do best. Fast-paced action gameplay and awesome visuals. Now, here's where the problem comes in. You've probably noticed over the years that Team Ninja's games usually feature some pretty nice-looking cutscenes. This is because Team Ninja regularly works with an animation group called didnt, who focus exclusively on cutscene work. Obviously, the Wii's real-time rendering capacity is a bit limited, so to achieve the level of fidelity they wanted, they were going to have to rely on pre-rendered cutscenes. But didnt is a company with a cinematic background, firmly rooted in the language of cinema and movie-esque narrative delivery. So even though Sakamoto had writing duties, didnt was largely in charge of actually presenting that story to the player. And with over 100 hands on the project between Team Ninja, didnt, and Nintendo, internal political pressures were almost guaranteed to change the plan. Suddenly, what was once just going to be a fun spin-off by Team Ninja with a sparse story, simply meant to tie Super Metroid and Fusion together, had bloated into a massive multi-hour epic, and the first attempt at a deep exploration of Samus as a character. Now, this is all just supposition on James's part. We weren't there to see what actually happened, but it does seem a lot more plausible to me than the idea that everybody got together in a meeting room and one of the brand managers from Nintendo said, "Hey, beach volleyball guys, why don't you take a crack at redefining the female central character to one of our most beloved franchises?" So I guess, lesson 1. Use caution when setting up your team structure and establishing project goals. You don't want to get yourself stuck in a scenario that forces you to attempt things this medium isn't particularly strong at. This brings us to the actual delivery of the narrative. There's an old adage in film and literature, show, don't tell. And there's a parallel adage in games, do, don't show. Unfortunately, Other M fails spectacularly at both of these, delivering almost the entire narrative through cutscenes, and then going one further by delivering the narrative in those cutscenes almost entirely through Samus's wooden monologue narration. There's a big problem with using monologues to do this job. It only allows for the exploration of a single character. Much of how we come to understand a person is based on how they interact with other people. In Other M, we get a lot of long, expository, often redundant monologuing from Samus, but since there's so little dialogue with the rest of the cast, Samus ends up surrounding herself with a bunch of uninteresting, disposable characters. It also severely limits Samus's characterization, and the meaning we can impart to elements like her relationship with Adam. This would have been easy to overcome with something as simple as comm chatter. They already established that Samus is in radio contact with Adam, so why not use that? Rather than having Samus stand there inner monologuing each plot point to us, have them talk to each other. You know, let them do a Snake and Otacon kind of thing. He's the intel, she's the firepower. Heck, Samus spends a lot of time just moving from point A to point B. That's a lot of time you could use to flesh out their relationship. Exchanging intel, cooperating to overcome obstacles, maybe some occasional idle conversation. Let us actually see and hear the connection they have. Think of how many games you've played where you got to know your squad mates better just by hearing what they shout during the action. This is a huge missed opportunity when you're trying to deliver a complex narrative about a well-established character. Not just for Samus, but for Adam. Maybe even more so for Adam. This is supposed to be the person Samus values most. Probably the only man she would voluntarily take orders from. But maybe with the exception of one scene near the end, I never look at these two in-game and think, wow, they really mean a lot to each other. So lesson 2. When characterizing a well-known character, you must use all of the tools available to deliver your narrative. A few cutscene monologues are not going to cut it. Next, let's do a little talking about the actual story itself. The weird thing is, when you strip the plot down to its most basic elements, it actually sounds pretty awesome. On the broadest level, it's a story about dealing with trauma, loss, and consequences that are far beyond the scope of what the human mind can address. In space. Sounds like a game I want to play. Unfortunately, the execution of that story falls far short, and what we actually end up seeing is a tale about Samus's desperate need for approval from a male authority figure, coupled with an hour and a half of exposition intended to catch new players up to speed on the series and tie Super Metroid and Fusion together. This desire to tie games in a series together for new players is often a trap that developers fall into. It's ruined more than a few games. New players and veterans alike are better served by delivering a good story with accessible characters that doesn't require the player to understand the rest of the series. Trying to deliver a compact version of the entire series story to date with each game is just going to be a handicap to your story. So lesson 3. Focus less on bringing us all up to speed, and instead focus on delivering a solid, accessible story that doesn't clash with your previous titles, but can still stand on its own. Then there's also the fact that we almost never see any narrative created out of the actual gameplay itself, and the only time we do, it doesn't make much sense. In Other M, we see Samus refuse to use life-saving equipment until she's arbitrarily authorized by her commanding officer, who doesn't technically have any organizational authority over her, she just likes the guy. It's not that trying to give a plausible story reason for why Samus doesn't have access to all of her equipment from the start is a bad idea. I mean, I actually like that idea. But you can't decide you're going to give story reasons and then do it half-assed. We're never given a good reason that makes sense for Samus to nearly kill herself following arbitrary orders. And this flawed execution leaves us with a character that doesn't quite match the Samus we've come to understand over the years. More on that later. And the execution probably wasn't helped much during the game's localization. Whenever you hear phrases like a certain blank popping up a lot in a game, it's often an artifact from a language where the subject of a sentence is often dropped or implicit. Phrases like that and terms like a deleter are pretty big clues to me that Other M needed a little more work in the transition from one language to another. Suffice it to say, lesson 4. If you're going to give a backstory to a beloved character, work very hard to get it right and make sure it's well localized for any market that you're going to bring it into. I know it's not always feasible cost-wise, but I'm going to say it anyway. It's really not a place you want to cut corners on a brand worth this much. Now, Samus's general demeanor in Other M has been discussed to death all over the internet, and we'd be here all day if we try to get into that here. Really, if you saw our True Female Characters episode, you can probably guess our stance anyway, so let's just save everyone some time. Go Google Other M story and you'll find a wealth of arguments for both sides. All I'm going to say is this. At the end of the day, I have a hard time believing that the Samus we're shown in this game is the same woman who has, until now, completely wrecked the space pirate shit on a regular basis. I'm not saying Samus should just be a total badass ice queen all the time and never show weakness or emotion, because that would be silly. A character without human flaws is a bad character. But the specific weaknesses she's given here and their place in the story don't sync up with the rest of her character. Now that's reason enough to complain, but why all the hue and cry around this game when, as an industry, we regularly fall short with our female characters? Well, because it's Samus. Often I hear the argument defending Other M's portrayal of Samus that Samus was a blank slate before this. Everybody keeps saying she was such a great character before, but she was barely even a character. How is that better? This Samus has personality, emotions, flaws. How can Other M not be true to Samus's character when she was hardly a character to begin with? I have two problems with that line of reasoning. First, just because Samus hasn't always had a voice or a detailed backstory doesn't mean she was a completely blank slate. As we've said before, actions define a character. We don't know a lot about Samus, but we can make a few reasonable guesses just by looking at the meager story details and game events. Here's what we know. We know she's chosen a career in bounty hunting, dangerous work, and that she prefers to operate alone. We know she's got access to and working knowledge of enormous firepower. And whoever she is, she's proven herself capable of single-handedly storming and toppling heavily defended bases and installations on multiple occasions. And we've also seen that she has a softer side through her interactions with the baby Metroid. And Fusion even hinted at a close personal connection she once had. Yes, it's all very vague and sparse, but there's a character in there. But those arguments I quoted earlier also suggest something else. That any backstory or characterization is inherently better than none. And I don't buy that. Let me ask you two questions. First, can you deliver a good story without giving a backstory for the main character? Hint, yes. Second, remember how interesting Anakin Skywalker in the Clone Wars used to be? Back when we knew only vague details about them? I mean, are you happier now that all the blanks have been filled in for you? Badly? Kinda makes you miss those days before we knew. Back when they had the potential to be something interesting and great. Or, heck, I got a better example. Let's shift our gaze just slightly to look at another popular Nintendo character. Silent protagonist hero, just like Samus. We don't actually know much about him, but we've spent enough time with him over the years to see that he's a brave, determined little guy and guided by destiny to defend the land of Hyrule time and again. Some games give him more personality, but never much. But some of you may remember that there was that one time when Link was fleshed out, characterized, given loads of personality. Remember that?
Well, excuse me, princess. Excuse me, princess. Well, excuse me. Excuse. Hey, excuse me, princess.
But we don't like that guy, do we? That guy is an idiot, nothing like the Link we've pictured all these years. He's not the Link we've come to know. More personality is not inherently superior to less. Now that's not to say you shouldn't ever try and add depth to characters like these, but a character fleshed out badly can be far worse than a character that's barely been fleshed out at all. So, final lessons for bringing narrative to a long-standing series. Just because you want to add narrative to the series doesn't mean you have to shoehorn in a bunch of backstory for the main character. And keep in mind everything you've established about the character before, even the little stuff. Just because the character hasn't spoken doesn't make them a blank slate. I think that's everything. Sweet closure. Thanks for letting me get that out of my system. Hopefully this will help to get everyone thinking for when somebody decides to tell the star-crossed tale of how Mario and Peach first met. See you next week.